Right, hello. In this video, we're going to continue building our React chat application. In this step, we're going to be continuing to add more interactivity to the page. Particularly, we're going to allow messages to be posted by different users. We're not doing user login or user authentication. We're going to cover that later. But what we're doing is we're basically going to let the current users sort of masquerade as different people in order to be able to sort of get messages showing up from different users in appearance. So what we've got is we're working off of the same general structure that we've been building so far. So we have our messaging system, which remember we're able to add new messages, right? So we can say be able to post new messages to our display. They show up here at the bottom, hello world. What I've added in is some extra work to start off with, where we have in our header bar, we've added in a series of buttons to represent the different users that we're going to be able to masquerade as, we're going to be able to pretend to be or switch to in our system. So the way that we've structured this together is I've created an array of sort of user objects, each one of which has an ID, a name, an image, so we can sort of keep all that information together. And then in the header bar, we're able to take those users and map them into a sequence of buttons, each button of which then represents a different person, right? So each button it contains an image that has that user's image and has that user's name on it. We've also added in I've previously added in some event handling for those buttons just to get this sort of all ready to go. So when you click on each of these buttons has an on-click event handler, and when we click on that button, that calls this handle click event handler function, which looks at the event and what button was being pressed. Note here that we're using the current target instead of just the target. That's because when we click on this button, we're actually clicking on the image. So the event's image is the target. And I don't want to get the name of the image. I want to get the name from the button. So what I'm doing is actually using the current target, which is the thing that actually got clicked and caused the event rather than the thing that the user clicked on, right? Because I click on the image and that kind of presses the button out behind it. So we then access the name we've associated with that button. Name is again being used an attribute to let us track which user is which. And then I'm doing some just basic logic filtering work, be able to figure out then which user they had selected from, and so I can get that user object. So that if I click on the zebra, it will log out that we have been able to find that, oh, you clicked on zebra, that's the element that's the user you want to switch to. And that basically sets up our application. So in order to be able to switch between different users, we need to be able to have some way of keeping track of who the current user is and then changing that over time. Because the current user, right, that's going to be some value, some variable, is going to need to be changing as we're using the application, that variable has to belong to the state. It has to be a state variable because we want to make it so that we store the current user in the state, and then when I click on a button, we can change who that current user is, and that can then re-render, re-log in, change what we're currently working on. So how are we going to make that work? Well, we need to add that state variable in somewhere. We could add that state variable here in the header bar, right? Because that's actually where our handle click is happening, right? That's where we're changing users. But if we think about it, the user of an application isn't really part of the headers information, right? Because we need that user information across our entire application, right? We want to know who the user is everywhere. We want to know who the user is down here at the composing form so we can be able to show a picture of who the current user is. So we want to be able to make sure that we're doing that kind of work. So what we then want to make sure that we're doing instead is we need to figure out where we want to store that state. So often we want to think through kind of like where's in our application, sort of in our program, if we look sort of our overall application, what component is should be responsible for which user is logged in, right? So we're keeping track of that information and telling everybody else. Well, because we want it to be applied across the entire application, it actually makes sense for us to put that state in the app component itself. Not all state goes in the app component. Remember that our messages are showing up inside the chat pane because the header bar doesn't care about what messages are existing, but who the user is, because we need it to exist in both the chat pane and in the header bar, we need to have it belong to the common ancestor. We need to have it belong to that parent so the parent can tell the header bar and the chat pane who that current user is. All right, so we want to make sure that we have some state to represent who that user is. So in order to do that, we're going to need to use our useState function. We'll import that from React, and then we can go ahead and create our state variable. As I said, we want this to represent the current user, so I'm going to call the state variable current user, which means our state setter is going to be called set current user. Remember, they always come up with the same name. And then we need to use our state. We need a default user for our current state. We need to say, like, who do we start out as? Like, who is the current user when the page first loads? So I'm going to go grab this null default user. That's sort of our initial starting person. And I'm going to have that. I'm going to put a copy of that object and say that is our initial starting user. So what this means, right? We've said our use state is we're going to be, here, I'll put a note down here. So our state variable is going to start at the null user, right? That's the initial value. Note that I'm storing an entire object inside my state, right? I'm not just storing the user ID, though I could do that and then track it later. I'm actually storing the entire object with all the data inside of it, because that way I can be able to pass down that data anywhere I need to, and I don't have to, for example, have a different component go look up or find some other way of referencing the user's image. I just have that information available. All right, so we've got our state. Once you've added in state, generally that's like our first step is say, great, make our state variable. Our second step is we want to then make sure we are displaying content based on that state variable. So as that state variable changes, we get to display different content. So we want to, for example, change maybe what the header bar looks like. Maybe we can like sort of highlight or outline or show which user is selected. And we'd like to change this this compose form, this chat message button here is what shows who that current user is. So we need to know the header bar needs to know who our current user is. And the chat pane, which is who owns the compose form, needs to know who that current user is. So we're going to need to pass that data down as a prop, which we can do. So we're going to give our header bar a prop called, I don't know, how about current user? We can call it whatever we want. I'm just going to stick with the same name. It doesn't have to be the same name, right? We can, because again, the name of a prop and the name of the value you're assigning to that prop can be different. They don't have to match a state variable. There's nothing magic here. There's no association happening there. I'm just giving it the same name because that way, anywhere in my code that I'm looking at it, when I see current user, I know, oh, that's the value I mean to be the current user. Right, done. So I'm going to pass this current user state variable down to the header bar. Great. Now my header bar gets the current user from the props. So of course we can destructure that from the props. We can get our current user, our target current user, by destructuring the props. Oh my gosh, the props to get that work. Right, that gives us the value we care about. And now that I have that current user, I can do some stuff with like how I'm displaying it. So for example, I can style my user button here, right? So I can add like an if statement that we might say that if the current button that we're drawing when we're showing on the screen, if its ID is the same as the current user's user ID, right? If those are the same people, then I could have the styling for this button become something like a background success maybe, which will give it sort of a green background in theory. Let me double check my notes. Yeah. Current user.user ID, that should be doing it. So in theory, that should work. Refresh our page, see why it's not working, and then we're going to debug it in our video live. That's great. Oh, it's probably because I spelled success wrong. There we go. So then we get a nice green, I don't know if you can see that, but it's a nice green highlight sort of around who that current user is. This is great, right? So now our state data is changing the content we are displaying, right? I just by adding in some conditional rendering there, or some options there. It's worth noting that we should be able to test out our application to make sure that no matter what our state variable is, it still renders correctly. So I can try putting in, instead of having it be this null user, if I instead put in the penguin user, my application should still render correctly. Like no matter what the state is, my application should render correctly, assuming the state is like of a so appropriate value. The reason that we can then do that is that way we can test to make sure that no matter what the state becomes, everything still looks and works the way that we want. And that way we don't need to worry about like what actually changing the state yet. We're really just saying if the state happens to be this variable, make sure everything works fine. That's the best way to build out your state, is to say, set up your variable and then make sure that as you change it manually, like hard code changing it, you're getting different rendered content. And that way you know that whenever the state changes, you're getting the right result at the end. Cool. And clearly we're now getting our, our highlighting is now moving around the way that we want. All right. Of course, we also want our image down here to change to reflect that current user as well. So that means that we're going to need to tell the chat pane, because the chat pane is the person who runs this part of the code, who that current user is. So once again, we are going to pass down the current user to my chat pane, which means my chat pane is now going to need to get that as a prop. Right, so I'm getting the current channel and the current user. Note that the order of these things and the order of these things don't need to match, because again, they're just objects. There's no order associated with them. Cool. Now that I have a current user, I can now do something with that rendered information, right? When I'm rendering my compose form, right, my compose form's person is rendering it, which means my compose form also needs to know who the current user is, which means we're going to need to keep passing that data down. We're going to keep passing that prop to components further down the tree, so that my compose form will also gain a current user prop, which it's going to get from the chat pane. So the idea here is that state is being stored in the app, kind of at the top level, right? It's being stored up here in the app, but the app is then passing information down to the chat pane, and the chat pane is then taking that and passing that down to the compose form, and then passing it down to the compose form. The compose form can then do something with that current user. So the compose form currently is displaying something based on this thing that I've called a user object, which I sort of hard code in to be the parrot to start with. We could just have that user object be whatever the current user happens to be. I can even get rid of it. I can even just delete that piece in the middle, and then just change everywhere I'm using it. So this becomes current user. Probably a little bit cleaner to do this. I'll make life a little better in the future. All right. Ooh. User, I got one more user object in here. Oh, there it is when for actually posting a message. So I'm passing down my current user to my chat, which means my compose form now shows me whichever user I've currently highlighted. If I wanted to change it, right, if I want to say, get me the parrot instead of that original person, right, I can go to my app and say, have my app initially be the parrot, and then that passes it down to the parrot. And of course, because my compose form is actually using this current user when we want to add new messages, I sort of refactor that a little bit. It means that I can say I am parrot by posting as the parrot. But if my current user happens to be somebody else, right? If we go back to having my current user be the penguin. And again, this way I'm changing who the current user is. I'm changing the state by changing the source code. So I'm not actually interactively adjusting the state right now. I'm just testing everything works with different state values so that I know that the rendering part, right, the state to display pipeline, that's all working correctly. Right, it says I am penguin, and that all works great. So in this case, the way we've set it up, we now have tested and sort of demonstrated that as long as we have a user object in the state variable, we're going to be able to display and everything will work the way we want. We get displayed the right content and we're able to post messages from the right content. Great. So that's step one. Step one is going to be set up your state variable. Well, step 1 and 2, right? Step 1 is set up your state variable, and step 2 is then make sure that you are rendering your content based on that state variable, whatever it may happen to be. Now that that's in place, we can finally add step 3, which is actually changing the state, right? We can make it so that when I click on a button, we will modify what the state variable is to make it do something else. So the buttons we have to click on, we're back up here in our header bar. So we're going to go back up to our header bar. And again, this is where we had this in this handle click function. I've done some pre-work to figure out what user got selected, object got selected, and now we need to do something with that, right? At this point, now we want to change the state variable. So we need to do that. Of course, the function that's going, in order to change the state variable, I have to be able to change it out of app, right? App is our state variable. That's our place it needs to go. So I need to tell the app is going to need to tell the header bar. It's going to need to pass the header bar a prop that says, how do you change the user, right? I need to be able to pass the header bar like a change user function that can be some change user function, right? Some change user thing that already exists. Now, remember, we don't want to pass down the state setter directly. I don't want to just hand the header bar like set current user function, because then it's possible that there's some constructions or some behaviors I want to manage around that within the app, right? Maybe the app wants to make sure that you're not setting the user to someone who's like, I'm not able to see a particular page, or they're not setting the user to be someone who's not actually valid, right? We want to make sure that the sort of all the user changing code happens inside of app, and app is the one who controls that. So similar to what we did when we were passing down when updating messages, we're going to create ourselves a new helper function that will let us change the user. So we can do that to start. We're going to go ahead and define ourselves a change user function. It will be a function that can take in a new user object, right? Who do we want to change this? Who do we want to change to? And then from that new user object, what we will do is we will then set the state to be whatever that new user object is. So we can now call our set current user to be this new user object. Now, I know this feels really redundant, right? It's like, why did you write a function that literally just calls the other function, right? It's just a pass-through function. And again, the reason here is about sort of keeping information isolated, keeping things private between different components. We want the actual function that we use, we want the actual name of our state variable and our state variable setter to only exist inside of this app. That way, if I decide to change this from being current user to just being set user or just being set something else, I won't have to change the header bar. Right? The header bar is always getting the same prop, the same change user function. So it helps keep things isolated. It helps keep your code sort of more compartmentalized and tends to make for better practice and better sort of software development. All right, so we've got our change user function. We're passing it down as a prop called change user function. Just to keep track, just again, this helps us let us know it is a function as opposed to anything else. So in our header bar, that's now another one of these props. We're getting our change user function from the props. So we make sure we have that information as well. Now that the header bar has access to that function, it can actually call that function in order to change the state variable. Now, it's not calling the set state variable directly. It's calling this other sort of wrapper function, sort of this public function that can then be able to tell us what to do. So we can call our change user function, and we can set it to now be whatever user value we selected by clicking on that button. Right, we're just adding in that extra piece. So again, there's a lot of sort of details about figuring out which data is which that I've already sort of I've written out ahead of time before this recording. You can sort of check this code to see how that works. But the idea here is that once we've got the state variable in place and we know what we want to do, when we click on a button, we're going to call a function that will eventually call the function that changes our state variable. All right. With that, we can reload. We're in our Penguin, and again, we're checking to make sure everything still works. I am Penguin. That works great. If we click on the parrot button, notice that it switches to parrot, right? That guy's now highlighted, and this guy's not highlighted. We've changed our state variable. When I clicked on this button, right, we figured out what button I clicked on, which was the parrot. I said change the user to be the parrot. That function goes back up to here. It calls set current user. Changes the current user, so instead of being sort of the initial Penguin to start out as, it changes it to now be the parrot. Because that state variable is now changed, it re-renders all of the components that need to use that state. So it re-renders the header bar. It says, hey, header bar, refresh, show yourself looking different with the user being different, right? Which the user does because it gets that information here, right? We're passing down the current user right there. It says, hey, chat pane, change yourself, re-render, so because you now have this new information. So the chat pane re-renders with, again, a new current user, so that it shows the new user in our chat bar. And of course, now that we've changed that user, we can now say, I am parrot. And I can now post as two different people, and they can now pretend to have a conversation, right? How are you today? Now we can go back to Penguin, and Penguin says, I'm just Birdie. Make up stuff. Right? We can now have these users be able to talk to each other. Again, we're not actually changing who the user is. There's no authentication. There's no login. As soon as I refresh the page, it all goes back to being being where it started. But this is just a way of letting us masquerade who each user is. This is a really good place to start because now we have a state variable where we have some state. We've built out our program to say, based on a current user, do different behavior. So that now when we want to add in things like user login or user authentication, we can add that in, and all it needs to do is change who the user is, and the rest of our application is up and running and ready to go. So often as we're building out complex React applications, we start with very simple state data and very simple state transformations to be able to sort of test basic functionality with a different set of state, with a different context. And then we can add more and more details on how to change that context in more complex ways as we go. So with that, we have our final users, and we're able to switch between different people, and we're ready to go. Last change I'll make just before we end, I'm going to initially set our app so it starts out as being back to being that null user. We start out being nobody to begin with. And now, again, if we try to post anything as nobody, we will then be able to see, like, nobody can now post things, but at least we've got that information in place. Again, that's another example of how we can add some state to create some more complex interactivity. Note that we didn't actually add that much code, right? I added in a state variable, I passed in a bunch of props, and I sort of added a little bit of changes using that props. It gets complicated because you have to keep track of all the different functions, right? If I want to add, when I added in that current user, I had to modify a bunch of different components to add in a prop and change a variable here and a variable there. It's a bunch of like little changes. So that's often the challenge of writing React, is just making all those little changes along the way. But if you make one little change at a time and just make the little change in a couple different places, testing that it works, you'll be able to build out very complex React applications fairly effectively. Great, thank you.